You're live with the BBC from our newsroom here in London. We want to bring you some breaking news coming in. We're waiting for a statement in the House of Commons from the Defence Secretary, John Healey, and he is due to announce a story that's now just hitting the newsrooms, which is that thousands of people are being relocated to the UK as part of a secret £850 million scheme set up after a personal data leak of Afghans who supported British forces during the conflict in the country. So what we can now report is that a data set containing the personal information of nearly 19,000 people who applied for the Afghan relocation and assistance policy was released in error back in February 22, and this was done. That data breach was carried out by a defence official. Now, the fallout from this data breach and something that's been happening over the past couple of years is that the breach resulted in the creation of a secret relocation scheme, the Afghanistan response route, back in April 2020. The scheme is understood to have so far cost £400 million. And as I mentioned, it's projected to cost a total of £850 million. Millions more is expected to be paid in legal costs and compensation. So just to give you a bit of background to this case, the Ministry of Defence only became aware of the breach over a year and a half after its release, when excerpts of the dataset were anonymously posted onto a Facebook group in August 2023. And details of the dataset include the names and contact details of the individuals who had applied for relocation to the UK, as well as names of their family members. And just to give you a sense of what's happened so far, so under this relocation scheme that came into effect after this data breach, we understand that around 4,500 people, made up of 900 applicants, so the individuals who were working with British forces, and approximately 3,600 of their family members have been brought to the UK or are in transit to the UK. So those are the numbers who have arrived in the UK since the scheme was set up back in April 2024. At the moment, we could not publish the details of this scheme. This was because of a super injunction that had been imposed on the media coverage of this story. But today, following a High Court ruling here in London, media organisations are now allowed to report on the existence of this scheme. Concerns had been raised by the government as to whether the publication of this scheme and the story could have led to the safety of people who were applicants of this scheme or whose data had been breached, whether they could come under some kind of harm by the Taliban government in Afghanistan. So we're keeping an eye on the House of Commons, because now that we're able to report on this story, we're expecting the Defence Secretary, John Healey, to deliver a ministerial statement. Of course, there will then be a response from the opposition Conservatives. So just to remind you of the breaking news that's coming in just the last few minutes or so, we can now report that thousands of people are being relocated to the UK as part of a secret £850 million scheme set up after a personal data leak of Afghans who supported British officials. And this data breach was carried out by a defence official. So what we know so far and what we can report so far of this story is that this data breach happened and actually, the information became public back in August 2023 when excerpts of this personal data that had been leaked by a defence official were published on Facebook. Following this data breach, the government went ahead to set up a secret Afghan relocation scheme, which is called the Afghanistan Response Route, and this was set up back in April 2024. So far, we understand that around 4,500 people, made up of 900 applicants who are working with the British forces, and 3,600 of their family members have been brought to the UK or are in transit to the UK as part of this Afghanistan response route. The expectation is that there could be more people who are arriving in the UK following this data breach. And just to remind you that journalists were not able to report on this story following a super injunction that had been imposed by the courts, the government saying it was concerned that any material that would have been made public about this case could have led to Afghans being put in danger. Afghans who are now living, of course, under the Taliban government that had fought British forces and allied forces in Afghanistan for many years. But now what we can report is that is the existence of this Afghan relocation route that has seen 4,500 people arrive in the UK following the leaking of their personal data on the internet. So this is fresh news coming into us here at the BBC. The BBC now, like other media organisations, able to report about the existence of the Afghanistan response route, which was set up back in April 2024. What we know so far is that this secret scheme, or a scheme that we're not able to publish about before, has cost £850 million. So far it's cost £400 million, pardon me. And the expectation is that that figure could go up to £850 million. Let's show you the latest pictures coming into us from the House of Commons now. Of course, other ministerial statements taking place at the moment in the House of Commons. A little earlier, we heard from Ed Miliband, of course, who is the Environment Secretary. But a lot of the focus at the moment will be on what the Defence Secretary, John Healey, has to say following this story, or the fact that media here in the UK can now publish this story. Just to give you a little more of what's coming into us from the PA news agency. It says that under plans set out last October, the Afghanistan response route was expected to allow up to 25,000 people, most of whom were ineligible for the relocation to the UK following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. So the expectation was that up to 25,000 under those plans set out by the government would be eligible to be relocated to the UK. But obviously at the moment we're not sure of what the final tally will be. Of course, that might be something that the Defence Secretary speaks to us about in his statement to the House of Commons. As I mentioned, there would be a response from the Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartledge, to that statement. And of course, the other parties in the House of Commons, the Liberal Democrats, Reform UK, the Green Party as well. Perhaps there might be questions about the number of people who are being relocated to the UK under this scheme. Migration has been a big issue. The relocation of asylum seekers or refugees to the UK has also been a big issue. I think at the moment, let's go live to the Commons now and let's listen to that statement.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on a significant data protection breach from February 2022 relating to the Afghan relocations and assistance policy. This led to the High Court granting an unprecedented super injunction and the previous government establishing a secret Afghan resettlement route. Today, I'm announcing to the House a change in government policy. I'm closing this resettlement route, I'm disclosing the data loss, and I'm confirming that the court order was lifted at 12 noon today. Members of this House, including you, Mr. Speaker, and myself, have been subject to this super injunction. It is unprecedented. And to be clear, the court has always recognised the parliamentary privilege of proceedings in this House, and ministers decided not to tell parliamentarians at an earlier stage about the data incident, as the widespread publicity would increase the risk of the Taliban obtaining the data set. But as parliamentarians and as government ministers, it has been deeply uncomfortable to be constrained from reporting to this House. And I'm grateful today to be able to disclose the details to Parliament. And I trust you, Mr. Speaker, and members will bear with me if I take the time to ensure the House now has the fullest information possible, something I discussed with you, Mr. Speaker, yesterday. Mr. Speaker, the facts are as follows. In February 2022, 10 months after the then Defence Secretary Ben Wallace introduced the Afghan relocations and assistance policy, 6 months after the fall of Kabul, a defence official emailed an Arab caseworking file outside of authorised government systems. ARAP, as the House knows, is the resettlement scheme that this country established for Afghan citizens who worked for or with our UK armed forces over the combat years of Afghanistan. And both in opposition and in government, we have backed this scheme. I know ARAP also has had the full support from across this House. Now, this official mistakenly believed that they were sending the names of 150 applicants. However, the spreadsheet in fact contained personal information associated to 18,714 Afghans who had applied either to the ex gratia or the ARAP scheme on or before the 7th of January 2022. It contained names and contact details of applicants and, in some instances, information relating to applicants' family members. And in a small number of cases, Mr. Speaker, the names of members of Parliament, senior military officers and government officials were noted as supporting the application. This was a serious departmental error. It was in clear breach of strict data protection protocols, and it was one of many data losses relating to the ARAP scheme during this period. Now, previous government ministers first became aware of this data loss in mid-August 2023, 18 months after the incident. They became aware of the loss when personal details of 9 individuals from the dataset appeared online. Action was taken to ensure they were swiftly removed, an internal investigation was conducted, and the incident was reported both to the Metropolitan Police and to the Information Commissioner. The Met deemed that no criminal investigation was necessary, and the Information Commissioner has continued to work with the department throughout. However, journalists were almost immediately aware of the breach, and the previous administration applied to the High Court for an injunction to prevent the data loss becoming public. The judge deemed the risk warranted going further, and on the 1st of September 2023 granted a super injunction which prevented the disclosure of the very existence of the injunction. Mr. Speaker, that super injunction has been in place for nearly 2 years, during which time 8 media organisations and their journalists have been served to prohibit any reporting. And no government wishes to withhold information from the British public, from parliamentarians or the press in this manner. In autumn 2023, previous ministers started work on establishing a new settlement scheme, specifically designed for people in this compromised data set who were not eligible for ARAP. Not eligible for ARAP, but nevertheless judged to be at the highest risk of reprisals by the Taliban. It is known as the Afghan Response Route, ARR. It was covered by the super injunction. And the then government initially established the ARR to resettle a target cohort of around 200 principals. But in early 2024, a combination of the Minister's decisions on the scheme's policy design and the court's views had broadened this category to nearly 3,000 principals. I want to provide assurance, Mr. Speaker, both to the House and to the British public, that all individuals relocated under the Afghan Response Route, ARAP, or the Home Office's ACRS scheme undergo strict national security checks before being able to enter our country. And the full number of Afghan arrivals under all schemes have been reported in the regular Home Office statistics, meaning that they are already counted in the existing migration figures. Now, as Shadow Defence Secretary, I was initially briefed on the ARR by James Heappey, the former Armed Forces Minister, on the 12th of December 2023, and issued with the super injunction at the start of that meeting. Other members of the present Cabinet were only informed of the evidence of the data breach, the operation of the ARR, and the existence of the super injunction on taking office after the general election. By this time, the ARR scheme was fully established and in operation. By this time, it was nearly 2.5 years since the data loss. I have felt deeply concerned about the lack of transparency to Parliament and to the public. I felt it only right to assess the decision-making criteria for the ARR. So we began, straight away, to take a hard look at the policy complexities, the costs, the risks, the court hearings, and the range of Afghan relocation schemes that the previous government was running. Cabinet colleagues endorsed the need for new insights into the scheme in autumn last year while the scheme kept running, and in December 2024 I announced the streamlining of the range of government schemes that we inherited into the Afghan resettlement programme to better establish value for money, establish a single set of time-limited entitlements, and support to get the Afghan families resettled. And I would like to thank, on behalf of the House, Mr. Speaker, our colleagues in local government, without whom this unified resettlement programme would simply not be possible. And then at the beginning of this year, I commissioned Paul Rimmer, a senior former civil servant, an ex-deputy director of the Chief of Defence Intelligence, to conduct an independent review. This review was concluded and reported to ministers last month. Today, I'm releasing a public version of Rimmer's review, and I'm placing a copy of that in the Library of the House. I'm very grateful to him for his work. Mr. Speaker, despite brutal human rights abuses in Afghanistan, the Rimmer review notes the passage of time, nearly 4 years since the fall of Kabul, and concludes, first, and I quote, "There is little evidence of intent by the Taliban to conduct a campaign of retribution against former officials. Second, those who pose a challenge to the Taliban rule now are at greater risk of a reaction from the regime. 3, the wealth of data inherited from the former government by the Taliban would already enable them to target individuals if they wish to do so. Which means, fourthly, he concludes, and I quote, "It is highly unlikely that merely being on the spreadsheet would be the piece of information enabling or prompting the Taliban to act." However, Rimmer is clear. He stresses the uncertainty in any judgments, and he does not rule out any risk. Yet he concludes, given this updated context, that the current policy we inherited appears, and I quote, an extremely significant intervention to address the potentially limited net additional risk the incident likely presents. Mr. Speaker, the Rimmer review is a very significant but not the sole element in the government's decision to change policy. To change policy, to close the ARR, and to ensure that court order is lifted today. Policy concerns about proportionality, about public accountability, about cost, about fairness were also important factors to the government. And this was not a decision taken lightly. It follows a lengthy process, including the Rimmer review, detailed ministerial discussions, and repeated consultations with legal advisors. And just as I have changed government policy in light of the Rimmer review, so the High Court today, in light of the Rimmer review, ruled that there is no tenable basis for the continuation of the super-injunction. Mr. Speaker, to date, 900 ARR principals are in Britain or in transit, together with 3,600 family members, at a cost of around £400 million. From today, there will be no new ARR offers of relocation to Britain. From today, the route is now closed. However, we will honour the 600 invitations already made to any named persons still in Afghanistan and their immediate family. When this nation makes a promise, we should keep it. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm also restoring full accountability for the government's Afghan relocation scheme to Parliament. And I would expect our select committees to hold us account now through the in-depth inquiries. Let me turn, if I may, now to the practical action that we've taken as a result of this policy change and in preparation for the lifting of the court super-injunction. Mr. Speaker, my first concern has been to notify as many as possible affected by the data incident and provide them with further advice. The MOD has done this morning, although I have to say to the House it has not been possible to contact every individual on the dataset due to its incomplete and out-of-date information. However, anyone who may be concerned can head to our new dedicated gov.uk website, wherein they will find more information about the data loss, further security advice, a self-checker tool which will inform them whether their application has been affected, and contact steps for the Detailed Information Services Centre, which the MOD has established. Mr. Speaker, this serious data incident should never have happened. It may have occurred 3 years ago under the previous government, but to all those whose information was compromised, I offer a sincere apology today on behalf of the British government. And I trust the Shadow Defence Secretary, as a former Defence Minister, will join me in this. Mr. Speaker, to date, 36,000 Afghans have been accepted by Britain through the range of relocation schemes. Britain has honoured the duty we owe to those who worked and fought alongside our troops in Afghanistan. The British people have welcomed them to our country, and in turn, this is their chance to rebuild their lives, their chance to contribute and to share in the prosperity of our great country. However, none of these relocation schemes can carry on in perpetuity, nor were they conceived to do so. That's why on the 1st of July, we announced that we would no longer accept new applicants to ARAP. However, I will reiterate the commitment we made then to process every outstanding ARAP application and relocate those who may prove eligible. And we will complete our commitment to continuing the review of the triples. Mr. Speaker, I recognise my statement will prompt many questions. I would have wanted to settle these matters sooner, because full accountability to Parliament and freedom of the press matter deeply to me. They're fundamental to our British way of life. However, lives may have been at stake. And I've spent many hours thinking about this decision, thinking about the safety and the lives of people I will never meet in a far-off land in which 457 of our servicemen and women lost their lives. So this weighs heavily on me, and it's why no government could take such decisions lightly without sound grounds and hard deliberations. During this last year, we have conducted and we have now completed this work. I commend this statement to the House.
So, Secretary of State James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State both for advance side of his statement and for receipt early this morning of a hard copy of the Rimmer Review. And can I thank the Secretary of State and the Minister of the Armed Forces for briefing me yesterday and for briefing other parliamentary colleagues today. Furthermore, given the nature of the super injunction, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that the timing and nature of this statement relates entirely to the court's lifting of that super injunction, I also recognise that it was entirely right for the Secretary of State to update the House at the earliest opportunity and welcome the opportunity colleagues now have to scrutinise these matters. To declare an interest, Mr. Speaker, I was a Minister at the MOD in August 2023 when the Department first became aware of the breach. My main role being to chair one meeting on the matter in August 2023 because I was the duty minister, but thereafter being Minister for Defence Procurement and this sitting outside my portfolio, I had relatively minimal direct involvement. That said, the Secretary of State has issued an apology on behalf of the government, and I join him in that, and in recognising that this data leak should never have happened and was an unacceptable breach of all relevant data protocols. And I agree it is right that an apology is issued specifically to those whose data was compromised. It is nevertheless a fact that cannot be ignored that when this breach came to light, the immediate priority of the then government was to avoid a very specific and terrible scenario, namely, an error by an official of the British state leading to torture or even murder of persons in the data set at the hands of what remains a brutal Taliban regime. As the Rimmer Review confirms, that scenario, thankfully, appears to have been avoided. Of course, the Rimmer Review was set up in January and reported to the Secretary of State in June, as we understand. I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker, it is entirely appropriate that the Secretary of State has sought to update the Department's understanding of the threat on the ground in Afghanistan that exists today, particularly for those persons in the data set who had previously been concluded to be at greatest risk of reprisals. However, the House will appreciate that when ministers became aware of this data breach in August 2023, we did not have the luxury of 6 months to assess the situation. As Rimmer says at paragraph 53, and I quote, the review notes that the passage of time is particularly relevant. And I know that my former ministerial colleague, former Minister of the Armed Forces, James Heapy, who led the response to the leak, will have been focused entirely on what he saw as his duty of care to those at risk of reprisals, based on the threat assessment that pertained at the time. But any threat picture is constantly evolving. And as I say, I support the Secretary of State's decision to review the MOD's understanding of the threat, and given the latest situation as reported by Rimmer, we support his conclusion that the Afghanistan response route, the ARR, can now be closed. Turning to the super injunction, I do entirely understand why this will be the subject of considerable interest, particularly for the newspapers and media outlets concerned. We have an independent judiciary, and it is not for me to comment on either the decision to grant the injunction in the first place, nor to lift it today. But it is surely telling that the Rimmer Review paragraph 56 states that planning at the time the government became aware of this breach in the summer of 2023 was based, and I quote directly, on a risk judgment that were the Taliban to secure access to the data set, the consequences for affected individuals may be serious. Had that not been the case, no doubt the court would have been less likely to grant the injunction, and certainly not a super injunction. So on the leak, can the Secretary of State confirm that this was by a civil servant and that ministers at the time took steps to change the casework procedure, i.e. not using spreadsheets sent by email, but moving to a more secure system fully within the entirely secure network? And can he confirm that although the data set was circa 18,000, only a relatively small portion of that data set was identified as being at high risk of reprisals, and only a small number have been settled here, which is why, as he stated today, the cost is around £400 million, not the figure of £7 billion that is being reported elsewhere? And can I agree with him that now that these matters are rightly in the public domain, that given the reassessment of the threat in the Rimmer Review, it would be wholly appropriate for the Select Committee and others to look into these matters further? Can the Secretary of State comment on one very specific item being reported? That, and I'm not referring to the person who made the leak, but another apparent third party who obtained some of the data was engaged in blackmail. Did the original Metropolitan Police investigation look at this? And if not, will he consider reopening it so that the police can have another look at that very specific point, which is very serious in its implications? Finally, we must recognise the huge role played by Afghan nationals in support of our armed forces. But any policy in this area must always be balanced against our own national interest. We support the government in closing the ARR scheme, and as we did with their decision to close the full Arab programme.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the tone in which the Shadow Defence Secretary has responded? Can I welcome him joining me in the apology on behalf of the British Government to those whose data has been compromised? And can I welcome also his acceptance that he put it's entirely appropriate for the Defence Secretary now, as part of a new government, to look to up-to-date the Department's assessment of the threat. And I am very pleased, and the House will have noted, that he supports Rimmer's conclusions and my policy judgments that the government has announced today. He is right. Rimmer, in simple terms, gives us a revised, up-to-date assessment of the risk, and in particular the risk of those individuals whose data may be on that spreadsheet. And he does confirm, highly unlikely, that their name on the data set increases the risk of them being targeted. Mr. Speaker, he asked me 3 or 4 specific questions. He asked about the official. It was a defence official. I can't account for the improvements in data handling that the previous ministers might have taken. What I can say, when I did his job in that period of opposition, was that this data leak was just one of many from the Afghan schemes at the time. And what I can say is that since the election in this last year, we as a government have appointed a new Chief Information Officer. We have installed new software to securely share data, and we have also completed a comprehensive review of the legacy Afghan data on the casework system. On the question of the £7 billion, Mr. Speaker, which I think he may have picked up from court papers, this was a previous estimate. It is not related simply to the Afghan recovery route. It is an estimate of the total cost of all government Afghan schemes for the entire period in which they may operate. And the significance of the decision that I've announced today means that that cost to the taxpayer as a result of the policy decisions we've taken today, compared to simply continuing the policy and schemes we'd inherited, means that the taxpayer will pay 1.2 billion less over this period. It means that around 9,500 fewer Afghans will come to this country, and above all, it means that we have restored proper accountability in this House and proper freedom of the media.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tamerjee Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, welcome it, and indeed his intent to now inject parliamentary transparency and scrutiny. However, this whole data breach situation is a mess and is wholly unacceptable. As I mentioned to the Minister for the Armed Forces during our recent secret briefing, that I am certainly minded to recommend to my Defence Committee colleagues that we thoroughly investigate to ascertain what has actually transpired here, given the serious ramifications on so many levels. However, as things stand, notwithstanding the contents of the Rimmer review, how confident is my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, that the Afghans affected, many of whom bravely supported our service personnel, will not be at risk of recriminations and reprisals?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can only recommend that he reads in full the public version of the Rimmer report that I've published today. The conclusions and the updated risk assessment that Rimmer sets out, taking an up-to-date view, recognising that the situation in Afghanistan is now nearly 4 years on from the point at which the Taliban took control, recognising also that the present regime sees those who may threaten the regime itself now as a greater threat to their operation than any perhaps former government official or serving official. So I'd recommend that he reads that, and I expect, as the Defence Select Committee Chair, he will want to take full advantage of this restored parliamentary accountability. I've always believed that our Select Committee system in this House is perfectly capable and actually better suited to many of the in-depth inquiries that often get punted into public inquiries or punted into calls for public inquiries. And I hope my honourable friend would have noted the fact that the Shadow Defence Secretary also endorsed that view.
Why the Liberal Democrats, spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I also thank the Minister of the Armed Forces for his briefing on this issue this morning. I'm pleased that this House now has the opportunity to scrutinise this alarming data breach. And it's right that the then government moved to introduce a new scheme to try to minimise the risk to the Afghan soldiers and their families who were caught up in this breach, of the 18,714 individuals in total. It's the very least that we owe them, given the sacrifices they made to support our campaign in Afghanistan. And I welcome the apologies from both sides of the House as a result of this data breach. But it does raise serious questions about how this was allowed to happen under the Conservatives' watch and the heightened level of risk it has created for those Afghans involved. So can the Minister confirm what steps have been taken to address the root cause of this breach and to ensure that it cannot happen again? Reporting this afternoon from the Financial Times suggested that an original relocation scheme considered for all 25,000 Afghan personnel could cost up to $7 billion. So will the Secretary of State confirm what assessment his department has made of that figure and why this was kept hidden from the public? The immediate priority must be to ensure the safety of all those individuals caught up in this breach. So what assurances can the Secretary of State provide that lifting of this super injunction now doesn't heighten any dangers for those individuals concerned? And what steps is he taking to ensure that the individuals whose data was leaked are aware of the incident? What additional support is now being provided to them directly now that the case is in the public domain? And in light of these developments, can the Secretary of State outline when the casework and final relocations under this and the ARAP scheme will be completed by?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome her response? Can I say that I actually provided answers to the House for 2 or 3 of her questions directly to the Shadow Defence Secretary on the steps that we've taken to ensure that one can never say never, but one can, and I am more confident than I was 12 months ago about the reduced risk of data losses and data breaches in future. I've also given a response on the 7 billion figure. The estimated full costs of all Afghan schemes that will run to their completion from start to finish because of the savings derived from the policy decisions we've taken today will be between 5.5 and 6 billion. The cost of the ARR scheme to date, the cost and the sums committed to bring the 900 principals and their immediate families that are in Britain or in transit is around 400 million, and I expect a similar sum to be the cost of those still to come. Mr. Speaker, finally, on RIMA, I think I said in my statement to the House that RIMA recognises the uncertainties, recognises the brutal nature of the Afghan Taliban regime, recognises that there can never be any risk, there can never be no risk in any judgments and decisions like this. It's one of the reasons that this is a decision that the government and I have taken with hard deliberation and serious intent. And, Mr. Speaker, I hope that the House will back it this afternoon.
Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by saying I'm grateful to the ministerial team for the early briefing that I got on this matter, which gave me an opportunity to read a report that came out from the FAC under the chairmanship of the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge and Malling. It was begun in September 21 and the report came out in 22. It's called Missing in Action, UK Leadership and the Withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was excoriating. The manner of the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan was a disaster, a betrayal of our allies, and weakens the trust that helps to keep British people safe. It said the government should keep better records securely held on locally employed staff, and we've heard this is one of the many data losses from Arup, to ensure that any evacuation can be carried out more effectively. It should devise a policy based on clear and fair principles about the assistance which will be offered to local partners in the event of a security deterioration, and report to us when that has been done. I hope that such a policy has been developed, that more lessons have been learned, and that the ministers will report to my committee about where we are now.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that ministers will report to her committee if she invites us to do so, and she's right to make that big argument that anyone providing data to the British government has a right to expect that personal data to be stored securely, handled safely, and not to be subject to the sort of loss or breach that too often we saw with the early days of the Afghan relocation schemes.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
I commend the Secretary of State for his honesty and agree with everything he says in his statement. What an appalling mess, but part of the original sin of us intervening militarily and then scuffling out. Can I take it on a wider point that we've learnt our lesson now and we've got over the sort of liberal imperial itch of the Cameron and Blair areas to intervene militarily in ungovernable countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria and Libya? Let's now just move on, but I support what he said.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his remarks. I'm certainly grateful to his for his support for my statement this afternoon. Although he hasn't said it, he's a big champion of press freedom, and I expect that he also recognises that an important part of our decision has been this period in which we've seen no public knowledge, no media reporting, no parliamentary accountability, and we set that right today.
Louise Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a former veteran of the war in Afghanistan, I was appalled to watch the chaotic mismanagement following the fall of Kabul that left Afghans that had served alongside us, alongside our troops, and those who'd worked so hard for a better Afghan, dangerously exposed. This was a situation that I had feared would happen, and I could see coming even when I served in Afghanistan in 2017. The fact is, the previous government had plenty of warning that this situation could happen and failed to plan properly for it. This data breach joins the litany of other data breaches, delays and failures of our allies, and will the Minister therefore agree with me that we must give our fullest support to those Afghans so they can rebuild a new life here in the UK?
Secretary of State.
I do indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I know from Afghan families that were relocated in the early days into our area, my own constituency in South Yorkshire. It was the voices of members of both sides of the House here speaking up in exactly the same terms that she has there, recognising the debt this country owes to many of those who worked alongside or served with our forces, that made the very difficult job that our forces undertook in Afghanistan possible in the first place, and provided a warm welcome and continue to do so to those Afghans we're offering a new home and the chance to rebuild their lives and contribute to our country.
Lincoln John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and the tone of voice that he delivered it in? I commanded the Scots Guards in 2010 in Afghanistan at the high water mark of violence. I was very well served by Naz and Mukhtar, and I will always be grateful to both the Ministry of Defence for getting them to Britain and to the communities in the country who have welcomed them to their new lives here. I do just want to focus in on a particular phrase that the Secretary of State used. The Shadow Defence Secretary asked whether it was a civil servant who carried out the leak. The Secretary of State said it was a defence official, and the Times is reporting that it was a soldier. I do think it is worth clarifying exactly whether it was a civil servant, a SPAD or a soldier, because conflating the term defence official to cover members of the armed forces is something which might come back to bite the Secretary of State if he continues to do it.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, this was a data breach that took place 3.5 years ago under the decision and leadership of the previous government and previous defence ministers. The challenge I faced, the challenge this government faced, was far bigger than the actions of one official that long ago. And my full focus since the election in July last year has been to get to grips with the costs, the proportionality or the disproportionality of the schemes in place, and this lack of accountability to Parliament, freedom of the press and public knowledge. And it is that set of factors that has taken up my time and my attention.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I noted that the Shadow Secretary of State made great play about the changes and the extra safeguards the previous governments have put in place, the ministers have put in place following this breach. But I also noted that Mr. Speaker, that the Secretary of State said that he'd had to make more changes and introduce new software. That suggests to me that it wasn't the changes that had been put in place by the previous government were not good enough. And can I ask him clearly, in terms of 18 months after the incident, who had knowledge of this in those 18 months that this data breach had taken place before it reached ministers? And how was there no checks on anyone who had access to that sort of data using it properly within the department?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friends poses questions to me in the House this afternoon that I simply can't answer. They date from a period that was well before I took office, and as he above all will appreciate, as a new minister, you have no access to the policy advice, the legal assessments, any of the papers or even the threat assessments that the previous government and ministers may have commissioned. That sort of subject, if I may, is, I think, proper material for the committee on which he serves in such a distinguished way on the Defence-led Committee, perhaps to take a deeper look and to call witnesses that may be in a better position to answer those questions than I can this afternoon. And finally, on the question of software, I'm afraid I'm one of the last people to be able to give authoritative views on the question of cybersecurity and up-to-date software. But I think it must be in the nature of this that such requirements for new software, for constant updating, is indeed constant. And so the fact that we have taken the steps in the last 12 months that I and our experts have regarded as necessary doesn't necessarily mean that the steps taken by previous ministers were inadequate. But what I can say, of course, is that in the Shadow Defence Secretary's position, during that period of opposition, we were aware we exposed some of the building backlogs in casework, the regular data breaches and the broken promises, sad to say, particularly in the early years, that too often characterised these Afghan relocation schemes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the statement given by the Secretary of State today, and as a member of the Defence Select Committee, I'm looking forward to giving this the due scrutiny that it deserves. So I won't go into the things within the actual report, but I think it's important to clarify. Is the Secretary of State also able to say whether the data breach in question, as in the past, or maybe now, be putting any serving members of the UK Armed Forces at risk?
So State.
I look forward to being called and giving evidence to his committee, if indeed it does launch such an inquiry. To the best of my knowledge and belief, no serving member of our armed forces is put at risk by the data loss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's staggering to hear yet another serious data breach under the previous Conservative government. Would the Secretary of State, well, they can bicker from the other side, but it was clearly a mistake when they were in power. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that we've inherited a chaotic and poorly managed system, and can he tell us what systems have been put in place to correct this so we won't see more systems where you are emailing an Excel spreadsheet absolutely beggars belief? Can we confirm that this would never happen again?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right in the criticism she levels, but I would just say to her, I don't think any minister can stand here, or no chief executive of any organisation can stand say with guarantee there will never be a data breach, a data loss, or a data error in that way. What I can say is we've taken steps to reduce the risk for that, and that we no longer do any caseworking on spreadsheets, which was in the early days of this scheme, the technology that was available, and part of the problem, I think, for this inadvertent mistake made by the defence official.
Sir Julian.
What worries me more than the lifting of this super injunction is the fact that we've closed down all the Afghan schemes at the very time that undocumented Afghans who felt it necessary to flee to Iran and to Pakistan are being rounded up for forcible repatriation to an Afghanistan led by the Taliban. I understand that the investigation over our obligation to the triples, the special forces that our forces trained, will be continuing, and I welcome that. Can the Secretary of State confirm that despite the closure of the schemes, anybody who is found to have worked very closely with our armed forces, who is in imminent danger, can still be rescued and admitted to this country?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, it is more than 4 years since the previous government, the previous Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, launched on behalf of this country the Afghan relocations and assistance policy with absolute full support across this House. There has been ample time for anyone who could conceivably believe they might qualify to make their application. That scheme and none of these schemes were ever conceived or designed to last in perpetuity, which is why we've closed them at the beginning of this month to any new applicants, which is why I've taken the decision based on RIMA and the other factors I've identified to end the ARR scheme today. But on the ARAP applicants, the sort of Afghans that the Right Honourable Gentleman is concerned about, where there are applications in our system remaining to be processed, we will complete that job. And on the triples, we will complete the second phase of the review that we've given a commitment to them and to this House to undertake.
Imbeg Hilliard.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's support for parliamentary transparency and for the work of the committee corridor in this House, and I have no doubt that my excellent colleagues who chair the various committees responsible will do a thorough job of examining this, and hope that he will facilitate the sharing of any information that may need to be handled in a sensitive manner. When the Labour was last in government, there were a number of breaches of this nature. His predecessor of his asked to be notified of every one, and most of those were human error. So it's great that we're updating the IT systems and dealing with that security. But can he just touch on what elements are going to be put in place to guard against that human error which inevitably creeps in?
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, for functions and roles like this, having sound, secure caseworker software, having good training and proper protocols, all of which are now in place, greatly minimises the risk that anything like this data breach that we now find out took place in February 2022 is likely to happen again. And most importantly, I think it also helps to provide the sort of reassurance that anyone should have, that if they are providing data to the British government, to the British state, that should be held and handled securely.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I feel the Defence Secretary will forgive me, I do detect some wriggling. And the fact is he justifies this super injunction, not telling Parliament, not telling the press, not telling the public, and unbelievably not telling those Afghans who were potentially in harm's way. And isn't it the case that his argument is actually very thin? Because even the MOD itself admits that Taliban-aligned individuals already had access to the database. So not telling those Afghans they're under harm's way is quite frankly unbelievable. And the precedent of a super junction is very concerning for this place. How do we know there's not another super junction about another leak? But of course he couldn't tell us, could he?
Secretary of State.
Well, I can say to the right honourable gentleman, if there is another super injunction, I've not been read in. But in his own characteristic way, he makes a really important point about how unprecedented, how uncomfortable, how in many ways unconscionable it is to have a super injunction like this in place. I hope in light of that, he will accept what has been a difficult decision to review the risks, the costs, the details of the scheme, the legal hearings that have taken place have all been components of an important policy decision that I've been able to announce to the House today, and I hope you will back that.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My husband served in Afghanistan and has always felt keenly the debt that our country owes to those who worked alongside and supported our forces. And I know that many of my constituents who also served there feel the same way. Does the Defence Secretary share my concern that if we fail to honour our debts, why would people in future conflicts trust us and support our troops? And does he agree with me that it is the right thing to do that we offer a warm welcome to Afghans who come to our country seeking sanctuary?
100%, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend speaks so plainly, so forcefully and so passionately. And it was one of the things that struck me most 4 or 5 years ago in the Shadow Defence Secretary's role, as we debated the obligation to put in place the ARAP scheme, that those who felt fiercest were understandably those who had served. Those who had, in this House, had been part of the 140,000 British men and women over 20 years that had served in Afghanistan, because they recognised just what a debt this country and they owe to people like those that her husband speaks about.
Gentlemen.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's pledge to restore full accountability for the Government's relocation schemes, but I am saddened that this is the first opportunity that we've had to talk about the closure of the ACRS and ARAP schemes on the floor of this House, given that those were announced by written statement at very short notice only 2 weeks ago. Can I ask a couple of specific questions? On the ARR that we've only found out about today, he mentioned 600 invitations that will be honoured. For those who were not accepted and part of the breach, are they aware of that? On ARAP, it has been closed to new applications, but again, and I've asked the Minister for the Armed Services about this before, what is the communication strategy for updating them? And on ACRS, it was never open to vulnerable women and civil rights defenders that it was aimed to protect. Again, what communication will the Government have with those individuals who are in hiding either in Afghanistan or third countries?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, we made the statement about the closure to new applicants of the ARAP scheme and the ACRS scheme that the Home Office runs on the 1st of July. The Honourable Lady will have had opportunity since then to raise those matters in this House if she chose to do so. And on the information to those who may be affected, we will honour those invitations that have been issued to 600 of those ARR individuals, and to everyone else on the data set. We have communicated that the latest position this morning. We are offering access to further advice through the government.uk designated area of the website, and that includes steps that individuals can take if they wish to get in touch with our Information Services Centre, a dedicated centre set up by the MOD in order to deal with questions and concerns that people may have.
Stella Quiz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a very shocking story that the Secretary of State has told us today, and I pay testament to his commitment to transparency about it. I would say that sadly for many of us, for whom that period of time will never leave us and our offices dealing with the hundreds of people ringing in, desperately distraught about what might happen to family relatives, it doesn't surprise us, because I have to be honest with the Secretary of State, this matter is not closed. I join with the member from New Forest East in being desperately concerned that we still have people who would have qualified under these schemes, but because of failures like this, fled Afghanistan or tried to go to other countries, we tried to raise with ministers but could not get meetings with them, and now we discover there were secret schemes. He will understand that right now MPs' offices across this country will be hearing this and worried that again they will get those phone calls, that again they will have those queries. He's right that there must be parliamentary scrutiny. Can he just assure us that there will be additional resources to support us in supporting our constituents who will come forward, and that he will keep an open mind that even 4 years later there will still be cases that are relevant to this scheme that should be heard and should be giving sanctuary here if we are to honour our debt to those people who kept our forces safe?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend? She has been one of the most active, most assiduous members of this House in championing the cause of constituents who and others who may be trying to get access to the scheme. I just say to her, this is almost 4 years since, it's beyond 4 years since the ARAP scheme was first established. There are still 22,000 ARAP applicants whose applications will be processed, and where there is eligibility established, they will be offered the relocation that this country has undertaken to give them. And those applicants need not have applied from Afghanistan. Many indeed have. And for the ARAP scheme from the outset, one of its most important features with the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan has been that it's been former female Afghans who formerly have worked alongside, and some even served in the Afghan forces alongside our own, that have been potentially at greatest risk, for whom the offer that this country has made to relocate to this country, rebuild and re-establish a life here has been most important.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State for his calm and sensible way that he's announced the change in government policy today. Mr. Speaker, I can already announce to the House that since a briefing earlier today, I've made preliminary arrangements for MOD officials to come and address the PAC to examine the cost implications, the 400 million spent so far, and I think the Secretary of State said in parenthesis there will be another 400 million for the 600 based in Afghanistan at the moment who have received invitations under the scheme. Can he give me and the House an assurance that those 600 people who must be in some danger, if they do need assistance, that will be rapidly provided?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is very fast off the mark, and I'm glad that he's already issued his invitation to his committee. So he's asking for figures as chair of the PAC. So the cost of what has been spent and committed in order to bring and get into transit the 900 principals eligible under ARR plus their immediate family members to Britain is around £400 million. For the remaining members of the ARR and the immediate families who've been issued invitations, we expect something similar again. But because of the policy decisions, and he may want to probe this in his committee, that we've been able to announce, and the changes we've been able to announce to the policy and the programmes we inherited, it means that the taxpayer should be paying over the next few years 1.2 billion less, and that around 9,500 fewer Afghans will come to this country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government decision to support the lifting of the super injunction today and bring this awful matter properly into the public domain. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it's right and proper that this issue now is fully scrutinised by Parliament?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I do indeed, and one of the important features for me in being able to make this statement, to set out the details before the House this afternoon, has been that we are now restoring the proper parliamentary accountability of government ministers and decisions we take and schemes that we run and spending that we commit on behalf of the taxpayer to this House. And I look forward to this House in this chamber, but I hope also in the appropriate select committee or committees will undertake that proper constitutional role in a way they've not been able to do so without being constrained over the last 2 years.
Deb Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, a difficult statement for the Secretary of State and no mistake. He says in his statement, though, that this was a breach of very strict data protection protocols. Well, on the basis of this breach and the other breaches around Afghan resettlement, clearly those protocols were not strict enough. He's declined to say whether it was a contractor or whether it was a civil servant or a service personnel. And I don't think anyone in this House wants to know who it was. I would like to know how senior that person was, because if it was a junior member of MOD staff, then that is, the delinquency is both systemic and personal. But if it's a senior member of MOD staff, the delinquency is purely personal on the basis of their knowledge and seniority. In this instance, it was brave Afghans, but what reassurance can he give us that brave personnel of the UK forces would not be similarly compromised by a level of delinquency similar to this in the MOD? And why the synchronicity with the lifting of the super injunction and the ending of the schemes? Isn't it more likely that we should walk a mile in the people who have fled the Afghan regime and think that maybe we need an ARR plus wash-up to get these people out of danger if it becomes a reality?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wanted this House to hear the policy decisions that I had made and wanted to announce. I wanted this House to hear that first. The judge, aware of the decisions that the government had taken, the announcements I was planning to make today, has taken his decision to lift the super injunction and deliver his court judgment at noon this afternoon. Look, on the question of the individual responsible for that original data loss, that's not something I'm prepared to pursue in this House. It's not something that was, it's clearly the overarching responsibility of ministers at the time. And I would just say to him, my full focus has been to get to grips with what we inherited, to take a fresh look at the policy that was in place, and to be able to be in a position with the proper degree of deliberation and sound grounds to be able to come to this House this afternoon and announce the changes that I've done.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure, like many members of the House, I feel a sense of anger that once again the Afghan people have been betrayed. I thank the Secretary of State for his candour in his responses and for lifting the super injunction which will allow proper parliamentary scrutiny. But will he assure me the 3 questions in particular will be answered? 1, how a year was allowed to pass between the initial leak and it being uncovered. 2, how an email with a spreadsheet attached was considered a serious way to send around what effectively amounted to a kill list of Afghans for the Taliban. And 3, it has been referred to the role of James Heapy in overseeing this. What role, if any, was held by the 2 Secretaries of State for Defence at the time, one who served until August 2023 and one who served from August 2023, to my mind, either side of the information coming to light. If we do not get to the bottom of those questions, we do an immense disservice to the British people, but worse, an immense disservice to the Afghans who've been let down once again.
Well, my honourable friend signals some of the areas that the necessary parliamentary scrutiny will consider. I have to say to him it was 18 months, not 1 year, between the original data loss and it first being discovered and brought to Minister's attention in August 2023. It was a spreadsheet. Sorry, his second point was this. This was a period in which officials were and the department was working at breakneck speed to put in place schemes that were novel, schemes that were urgently needed, and clearly that sort of spreadsheet software is inappropriate for this case working system and is no longer used in that way. And then finally, I just would say he's asking about the role of my predecessors. It was Grant Shapps, who was the Defence Secretary, who oversaw the design, the extension, the establishment of the ARR scheme.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As well as risking lives, this extraordinary error has cost taxpayers huge sums. The Secretary of State says it will now cost 1.2 billion less, but what will be the total cost of all these schemes after that? First, given the extraordinary lack of transparency that this Parliament has been subjected to and voters to, will the Secretary of State agree to publish the legal advice that led to the expansion of the ARR and other schemes so we can have a proper discussion about it? And second, the Secretary of State did not mention any official resigning or being sacked over this extraordinary episode, and I think my constituents will find that quite surprising. Will he name the number of people who have resigned or been sacked over this extraordinary error? And if nobody has resigned or been sacked, does he agree that that is the wrong thing?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not in a position to make a decision about publishing the legal advice that led the previous government and Defence Secretary to extend the scheme. It's not legal advice that I have had access to or seen. And I just say to him on the question of costs, his right honourable friend, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, will do that. He's not in his place now, actually, but he will do the job on this. I can confirm for this House this afternoon that the total cost of all Afghan relocation schemes to date for those 36,000 Afghans that have been brought to this country is around 2.7 billion. The expected cost over the entire life of those schemes to bring anyone who may subsequently be proved eligible for these schemes is between 5.5 and 6 billion pounds, and that is at least 1.2 billion less because of the policy decisions that I've taken this afternoon.
Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for his openness and transparency and his apology. And whilst I'm on my feet, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank Portsmouth City Council for their involvement in Afghan resettlement schemes, many of those who served along my constituency members in Portsmouth North. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the decision today and the time this government has rightly taken to consider all of the options and examine the complexities through the RIMA review, the cost to taxpayers and the safety of those affected, alongside the need for transparency, openness in this House, to the press and also to the public. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Secretary of State agree with me that we must, as a government, reaffirm our commitment to public transparency? Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do agree with my honourable friend. This House is doing so this afternoon in response to the statement that I've set out to the House. And can I say to her local council in Portsmouth, the role they are playing and councils across the country are playing in making sure that there is a warm welcome and a unified Afghan resettlement programme in place for those Afghans and their families that we are welcoming into this country is remarkable. We thank them for that, and we as a central government and this House couldn't see these schemes operate effectively without our local councils.
Duncan Smith.
Madam Speaker, I commend the Secretary of State's statement today. I'm not going to dwell on the past because that will be something I'm sure the Defence Committee will have a look at and other committees. I want to bring him into where the future goes on this. Now, in closing all these schemes, there are still people out there who may not recognise the statement in this report that says no longer a widespread campaign of targeting individuals. I have one in my mind. The Minister of State knows exactly who I'm referring to, one Sami Atai, who is has fled and is in hiding in Pakistan. His brother has been arrested in their pursuit of him. He didn't get directly employed by the British government because he couldn't have done for security reasons, but testaments from people like General Ollie Brown and others all say that he saved lives for British servicemen and women. We owe people like that, surely, a debt of honour and gratitude for their work. So I simply put it to him, could he now look at what might replace the schemes that he's got rid of, which were inflexible, very narrow, and often left out those who really did this government a service. And I'd be grateful if he'd come up with some flexible idea in due course that allows some of these people, possibly, to seek succour here in the United Kingdom.
State.
I hesitate to be too blunt with the right honourable gentleman because I have a great deal of respect for him. But with any applicant, if they're not eligible for the criteria of the scheme that this House has approved and the government has in place and operates, that can really only lead to one decision. And I don't want to raise false hopes as he encourages me to look in a creative way at other options. My honourable friend, the Armed Forces Minister, is very familiar with this case. We will look at it again, but I don't want to raise false hopes for him or the man that he describes so vividly and with such concern to the House this afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm proud that Bracknell Forest is involved in the Afghan resettlement programme and is offering transitional support to the brave Afghans who risk their lives to support our troops. But any scheme like this depends on public trust. So it's concerning to hear that under the Conservative government, instead we had secrecy, security breaches and a super injunction. Will the Secretary of State take this opportunity to reconfirm two commitments? Firstly, that this government will continue to honour the moral obligation we owe to those Afghans who fought alongside our troops. And secondly, that we will do so in a way which reaffirms this government's commitment to public transparency.
Secretary of State.
I will indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, both the continuing commitment to honour the obligations and the duty that we owe to those who served or worked alongside our forces through the ARAP scheme. We will complete the processing of any applications that are outstanding, and for any who prove eligible, they will get the full relocation and resettlement support. And I'm glad this afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be able to restore a degree of that parliamentary scrutiny and transparency that our system in Britain depends on.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement. In that, he said, when this nation makes a promise, we should keep it. And I agree. In the chaos of withdrawal, my constituent, who left under ARAP, was made a promise by British officials that his pregnant wife could follow him. 2 years later, we have still not kept that promise. My constituent's wife and child continue to move around in Afghanistan to evade the Taliban, and my constituent is so desperate that he is talking about returning to Afghanistan despite the risk to him to be reunited with them. The Minister for the Armed Forces knows this case, and he has told me that the MOD will not consider it and is now a matter for the Home Office. So in light of this, will the Secretary of State repeat his commitment that our nation should keep its promise to my constituent? And will he undertake to engage with the Home Secretary to discuss how her department will ensure that cases like this are afforded the proper treatment in light of our commitment to the Afghan people?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I will take a look at the case he raises, and if required, I will also speak to my right honourable friend and colleague, the Home Secretary.
Josh Fenton-Green.
Deputy Speaker, can I start by paying tribute to all of the diplomats and armed forces involved in what is clearly an extraordinary operation. It's a stark reminder that our asylum system, despite demagoguery sometimes in this place, often represents a sacred duty to those who put their lives at risk for us and our allies. Can the Minister confirm to me that while the ARR is now closed, we will continue to process cases of those in the ARAP scheme since the 1st of July, including one that I've raised with officials?
Secretary of State.
Yes, my honourable friend speaks very powerfully. Where there are outstanding ARAP applications, they will be processed. Where there are outstanding triples cases that fall into the second phase of the review, that review will be completed. And where there is eligibility for ARAP entitlement established, that will be honoured.
Deputy.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
You're with BBC News Live. We have been following the ministerial statement that has just been given by John Healey, the Defence Secretary. He was speaking in the House of Commons for the first time, revealing that the British government had set up a secret scheme that would allow Afghans who are at risk of retribution from the Taliban to come to the UK. Of course, the BBC and other media organisations could not report on this secret relocation scheme that had been caused by a personal data breach because of a super injunction that had been ordered by the Royal Courts of Justice, the High Court. So today that injunction was removed, the government revealing details of this relocation scheme. So far, it says 4,500 Afghans, 900 principal applicants and their families have been relocated to the UK or they're en route to the UK. The cost of those relocations so far has been £400 million. The expectation is that there would be another 4,000 applicants coming to the UK as a result of this data breach. And that figure for those locations could be about £400 million as well. But of course, as we heard there in the House of Commons, questions from MPs asking for there to be further investigations into how this data breach happened and the possible consequences. Thank you for joining us on BBC News Live.